Microsoft. And really, I have to come out and say this, that Microsoft has been a sponsor and a backer of a lot of the coolest and most innovative projects in data protection, in prevention of fake news, of supporting digital literacy education. And so I'm so happy to have you here, Neal, as well. And Amin Mashariki, who was the former chief analytics officer for the whole city of New York. Right now, he's the data and digital research fellow at the Georgetown Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. The work that all three of these people are doing and have been doing is so incredibly important to me, and I'm sure to many of you here. So I'm so excited to have all of you guys with us. Now, do we have everybody on the line, all lined up in the green room? Just let me know when everybody's ready. But I also wanted to focus everybody's attention on the little tab that says polls at the bottom. So we are going to be pushing polls in each of our 3 sessions today that you can feel free to answer. There's 3 questions in each poll, and we're going to be collating that data for our quarterly report as well. So please do put your attention to the polls when you have a minute and answer some of those questions about how you feel about these different issues. Let me see if I can bring this up real quick, and I'll read the questions that we have up right now. We have, for our first question, data rights of individuals should be considered fundamental human rights, protected by laws and enforced regulations. Yes or no? If you owned your data as your property, would you allow companies and governments to pay you to have access to it? And if you could save lives during a crisis by sharing your location data safely and anonymously, would you do it? So if you can go and vote on those for us, that would be fantastic. And do not forget about the questions, because we have a long time for each of these panel sessions. So please do ask the questions. I'll be monitoring the questions and see which ones are upvoted the most so that I can get those asked to our panelists. Thank you so much. Let's see. Waiting for everyone to get pushed into this room with us. I believe they're in the green room and being pushed over. Again, thank you guys for being with us for this summer experiment. This is my first time doing this, and I'm sure for a lot of you, this is your first time attending an entirely digital summit. But now that we're leading completely digital lives, I think it's important for us to enter into this experiment together with all of the bugs and things that comes with. So thank you for your patience while we get everybody on stage for what is one of my favorite conversations, data rights. We're going to hear from these incredible experts about the types of work that they're doing to protect and secure privacy. Oh, here we are. Dominique, such a pleasure to see you. How are you doing?
Great, nice to see you. Thank you, Brittany, for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So happy to have you here. So just so everyone in the audience knows, we're going to have each of the panelist speakers have 5 minutes to introduce themselves and their work before we go into the panel discussion. So we'll kick this over to Dominique first so that she can tell you a little bit more about her work at Perkins Coie. I see that she is just waiting to reconnect real quick, and then she'll talk to us about her work. So thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Brittany, for having me. So I sit in our privacy and data security group at Perkins Coie. We have about 1,000 attorneys. About 67 of us are in the data protection and privacy group. And I am the global co-chair of our firm's ad tech privacy and data management team. In that capacity, I work with a number of companies ranging from Fortune 500s to startups, to help them, just deal with the issues of privacy and data security with the evolving challenges that we're facing. So we have I think we're up to about 134 data protection laws around the globe. In addition, increasing attention to these issues a lot due to your work, Brittany, in the U.S. And so I sit in Los Angeles, California, and certainly with the California Consumer Privacy Act, we have a lot of interest in privacy and data protection here in the U.S.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your work. And I'm sorry if I ever gave you extra work to do in the evenings. But I appreciate everything that you're doing for us, working with a lot of the most innovative and powerful firms. I'm also reporting live from Los Angeles, so good to see you in my new hometown. So I would love to bring our next speaker to the stage to briefly introduce themselves. Are we able to push that up? Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. I believe we should have Neal or Amen joining us next. Oh, perfect. Good day, Neal. How are you? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. So real briefly, I'm the lead commercial attorney at Microsoft. So for the last 10 years, I've been working both with the company and with customers and partners as more and more customers move their operations on top of our cloud backbone. Obviously, COVID is driving a couple of different motions. One is more and more businesses, schools, what have you, moving onto more of a digital delivery model. The second challenge is actually that we're seeing a lot of well-meaning projects, both internal to Microsoft, that's actually relatively easy to manage against kind of our principles of how we think about privacy, security, AI and ethics, etc. But when it becomes much more challenging is those who want to use our platform to go build tools. And the question then becomes, how much do you want companies like Microsoft really making decisions about what does or doesn't happen? And it's a very, very difficult challenge. I think if you look at the project that Apple and Google announced, which is all well-meaning, we're going to see a lot more of this. I think your early speakers were talking about this. We're going to see a lot more of these challenges. And the reality is we are going to be faced as societies around the world with a question, which is how much information do we want to provide to try to come back from or work through while this virus is raging around the world? It's going to be a very, very hard question to answer. And most importantly, it's going to be a question that I think requires clear guidance and really directives from governments with influences from the population, from all corners, to really make sure we get these rules right. And particular concern, I think, with people of color and those in societies who maybe have less voice and less right or less ability to assert rights. If you think about frontline workers, you think about even people who are stocking our grocery stores or delivering, if we're lucky enough to get deliveries. I do think that we have to worry about what are the disparate impacts of the tools we build on the data that's being developed around them that they may need to survive these tools. But then how is that data going to be used, if it is used at all? These are the hard questions I think we really, really have to start asking and answering now. So thank you very much for having me on the panel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Neal, for being here and for all of the work that you do. I would love to have Amen on the stage to have his introductory remarks, and then we will move into our panel discussion. So I'm sure we will see Amen's face very shortly. Very excited to have you here, Amen. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Sure. So currently, I'm the global director of the Data Lab at the World Resources Institute. Also, as you mentioned, a research fellow at the Beeck Center for Social Innovation and Impact. And previously, I was the analytics officer for the city of New York. And I think there's a consistent thread that I can draw between all three of those roles. And that is that one of the things that I've seen is that, sort of data privacy and data rights are directly correlated to our ability to effectively and appropriately respond to crises and emergencies. And specifically, in the role at Beeck Center, we engage with public officials often to work with them to help them think about how to use data to solve problems, to respond to emergencies, in particular this one, COVID-19 and others. And also in my time in New York City, I worked on that work. And the key thing that I saw was that we did not utilize open data as much as possible. And open data is a way for us not to violate individuals' data rights, because that data has been made open and engaged by the public in so many ways prior to use. I think the challenge with emergencies and responding to emergencies and bringing data to bear with respects to emergencies is that at the time of the emergency is when we start asking questions about, can we use this data? Should we use this data? How do we use this data? Who is it going to impact? So on and so forth. And one of the things that we've seen with open data is once you make a data set open, in a respective city, state, or even federal government, and in our case, at the World Resources Institute, in that organization, you make it available for people to ask questions, to challenge, why do you have this data, to understand how it's being used, to think about all of the ways that it can be used against the reason why it was originally opened up. And so, I bring that angle to this conversation. I do believe, and I'm somewhat biased here, I do believe government has an opportunity here to get out in front and to lead the pack, private sector, NGOs, and so on and so forth, to lead the pack in terms of data rights and data privacy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Amin, and thank you for everything that you're doing. Such a pleasure to have you here. So I would love to also bring back Dominique and Neal, please, so that we can begin our group conversation. Fantastic. Welcome back, Neal.
Thank you.
Perfect. And Dominique should be here in just a moment. Once we see her wonderful face, then I can begin, just to make sure that she can hear the first questions that I ask. But thank you guys so much for everything that you're doing and for sharing your perspectives with everyone. We have, 654 people on live with us right now. So that is incredibly exciting, from countries all over the world. So great. We have Dominique now too. Wonderful. Thank you guys. So we're talking about data rights here. And obviously we are still in a massive transition where companies and governments are grappling with the implementation of GDPR. Only on January 1st did we have the California Consumer Privacy Act passed, and a lot of companies have not even begun to comply with that right when a crisis hits and the need for data is so strong. So I would love for you guys to think about how we can discuss, while implementation of new data and privacy protections are coming in, has all of that been temporarily thrown out the window, or are we still retaining our fundamental data rights and freedoms that are still so new to us?
Well, I'll just start, with California. Our California Attorney General, with respect to the California Consumer Privacy Act, Javier Becerra, has made a statement that he's not going to be delaying enforcement of the California Consumer Privacy Act in light of COVID-19. And so that is a differentiator for California versus, I know some of the other global data protection authorities have taken a different approach. That's not true for Attorney General Becerra. Actually, on April 10th, he just sent out a press release reminding Californians of their data protection rights, and reminding them that they have those rights in light of the massive amount of new information that's going to be collected from California residents as it relates to temperatures, health, and so forth. So I think that at least in California, I can say I don't see that being suspended globally. We've seen the data protection authorities take it a lighter touch.
Can I jump in here and say that, enforcement around these sorts of things are so challenging and so complex. And so I think, being able to put a law out, but then also being able to enforce is a different story. If you even think about HIPAA regulation, HIPAA is really focused around not sort of this enforcement concept. It's when certain things happen with medical data, here's the steps you have to take to respond to that, right? And so, I mean, that's going to be key. What's going to be key is not so much saying, hey, listen, when this emergency happened, whether it's COVID-19 or some other emergency happens, well, we've got enough enforcement in place to ensure people's data rights are going to be not going to be trampled on. You have to have that, but you also have to have mechanisms in place prior to an emergency to say, here's how we should respond. Emergency first responders, do things like tabletops. They do things like drills to say, here's how we're going to respond when an emergency happens, so that they have those processes and protocols in place. So you have to do something before emergencies around data sharing. What can we do? How would we share data? What data would we share? What data do we not want to touch? Then you have to have mechanisms in place after the fact to report out. Here's what we did. Here's how we did it. So for instance, when there's a breach in any government entity, governments know how to email you and tell you, and the federal government will email you and tell you, here, we think your data has been breached, so on and so forth. Or any private entity will send you an email. We think your data has been breached. Here's the steps you can take. We should also be putting in mechanisms after the fact to say, we used certain data of yours to respond to this. Here's what we used, and here's why we used it, right? I think governments like Estonia have these processes in place. So we have to think about the before and the after, and the enforcement does still need to happen during.
Yeah, and I think for California, those two merge together, because what Californians have is the right to find out what information has been collected about them in the year prior. So that will happen, but this is the microcosm. I agree with what you're saying, Amin. It really needs to be sort of a global approach because it's a global pandemic.
Absolutely. And in terms of the global approach, have you seen significant or successful coordination at the international level between governments, especially since you're working with so many international firms as well?
I think there's a lot of collaboration, but this is so new for so many different, for everybody really. And so I think we don't have the level of coordination yet on the data protection front. To Amin's point, and also to what Neal was saying, it's really important that that a global top-line approach to addressing privacy and data security in general, and certainly in the midst of a pandemic, is really important. So you have location data being used, like the first speaker was talking about, by governments without really necessarily any consumer consent or user consent. We've got thoughts about doing something here, which will be more anonymized. And it's more of a patchwork. And I think some of that is just based on our fundamental differences in structure. But I don't know.
One of the things I thought I'd offer up to consider is I think at a governmental level, it's pretty obvious that governments aren't doing a really great job of coordinating with each other. Even down to where did the virus start? Not for reasons of science to try to determine how to stop the virus, but to somehow try to claim one country's fault or what have you. They're to blame for something that is truly a global problem and will be probably repeated several times in the very near future if we don't take some reasonable steps in a whole series of public policies. I think one of the things we should keep an eye on is many of the businesses, the largest businesses in the world, operate. We operate, frankly, in about 130 or 40 countries, and in some respects, businesses like that start becoming the glue that really drives what is going to have to happen mechanically, but then needs very, very clear rules and guidelines to make sure it doesn't happen and obliterates people's rights. Because, business is not very good at that. Business is good at solving a problem or generating revenue. But it starts getting a little tricky if you don't bring in other players to really start driving home what are the baseline rights that can't be trodden upon. And I think you're going to find that if you just take the airline industry, if there is not some reasonable sharing of information and therefore rules around what that sharing is and what I think transparency was, or what I was hearing from Alman, which I'm a huge fan of transparency so we can make informed decisions. But then, of course, we have to have informed decisions, and then we have to have rules in place to hold governments accountable and hold companies accountable and hold individuals accountable when those rules are violated. But I do think you are not going to be able to start up, let's say, international air travel unless governments are willing to start figuring out what are we going to fairly share while we also protect individual rights, recognizing that different countries have totally different perspectives about that. So we do need some kind of international baseline that people can plug into. And I think you may see that starting from large multinationals. I don't think they can solve it. I think they may start the conversation because it will be a necessary one.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. Obviously, we've had GDPR come to pass in May 2018 for Europe. We have CCPA, which is now by most companies being respected for the entirety of the United States. But there are still so many countries that have not passed national legislation and regulation with guidelines on what we should be doing to protect data and privacy. So our large multinational firms in countries that do not yet have national protections enforcing GDPR or CCPA similar regulations in their work in those countries?
I think Dominique can probably answer for the industry more broadly. Amin may have a point of view. I can certainly tell you that from our perspective, it's hard to run our network unless you have a standard. So we just run it to the standard. So if that the least common denominator is GDPR, that's what we run. There are obviously some specific differences, but overall, the way we run our operations to the highest privacy standard we can. So that's kind of how we run our business.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with industry. There's, I call it top line compliance, but it's where industries will look at sort of across industry, healthcare, financial, retailers, e-commerce. They tend to look at where they are doing business and what, where they are globally. And they might map to maybe the highest standard depending on to develop a global program. So they might map to Canada for emails and Europe for global transfers, data transfers, and then the US now for sale, opt-outs as it relates to sales. So there's an effort to coalesce and then perhaps tweak and get to the highest standard and really revisit those policies on an annual basis.
I think one of the more interesting but obviously controversial debates that we're seeing right now is the success of different countries in flattening the curve and preventing the spread of coronavirus. And there are some countries that don't have the enforcement of the same fundamental rights and freedoms around data and privacy that we do in the country I'm sitting in, or obviously throughout Europe. Now, have you seen projects that have been implemented by companies and governments in certain places in the world be very successful because they had that automatic access to everyone's data? I know it's a controversial question, but I really want to have this debate. Should governments and companies be able to instantly access data in times of crisis? I know Amin, of course, working as the chief analytics officer in a city like New York, has probably had to think about this very intensely in many situations. And so I'd really love to hear your opinion on that, no matter how difficult it is to talk about.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Let me answer this from, a data scientist perspective. Mm-hmm. I think the complexity that comes with being a data scientist is understanding that you have to solve a problem. You have to respond to a need. You have certain data that might be right in front of you that you can use, but there may be regulatory and legal challenges to utilizing that data. When I was in New York City, I was the director of the mayor's office for data analytics and led a team of young data scientists. a small team, 8 or 9 at its max. And they were always charged with identifying not only the right data to respond to a question, but also the best data to respond to a question. Let me also throw something into the pot here, which is I was very deliberate in hiring people that were into that group that were representative of New York City in every way, shape, or form, such that they not only themselves embodied New York City, but they would also be good representatives of the residents of New York City and understand data that they should use and understand those rights and bring those back to the forefront. I think one of the best things about my background that allowed for me to play that role was that I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. So I understood the people that were going to be who their rights were going to be trampled on if we used certain data. And that was at the forefront of my mind. And so you have to lead with that. I think it's always easy, to go to, certain data shops that sell data for, a king's ransom to governments and grab that, run a model, start answering some questions. That's easy. You can do that all day. I think the challenge is taking into consideration data rights and then utilizing data that might be a bit more complex to use, but doesn't violate people's data rights. And so you just have to be thoughtful. And data science is not, as they say, beanbag. It is for big thinkers. And it's not just about the science and math, but it's also about the culture and the environment and social science as well.
I totally agree with that. I think one of the biggest considerations when we're thinking about times of crisis is how do we protect the most vulnerable? And in some situations right now, especially during this crisis, the most vulnerable are the people that already have health issues that we need to make sure that the coronavirus does not spread to them. But also we think of vulnerable populations in terms of individuals who can be targeted in a discriminatory way because of the data that a government or companies might have access to. And we've had a lot of problems with that, especially in the United States over the past few years. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the protections that you see being put in place against those types of abuses.
Let me jump in and say something about the vulnerable. I find it quite interesting that, 4 weeks into this crisis, we suddenly got this epiphany around, oh, wow, Black and brown people are impacted more so in this case, or people in certain underserved communities are impacted more by this. But what's interesting is if you go all the way back to Katrina, the same thing happened, right? All of this happened, and all of a sudden, the United States, for the first time, figured out, oh, there's people in New Orleans who actually don't have access to certain amenities and certain resources in order to have gotten out on time. Why didn't they listen to the calls that were on TV and on the radio and so on and so forth? Well, they didn't have the resources to do that. Why is that? Right. And I think digging into that around data rights is very key, which is people in these underserved communities have been so engaged in such a way that they don't trust sort of the government. Right. And they don't trust what the government can do. So as far as they're concerned, they don't want their data out there. You go to some of these communities, they're like, we won't use 311 apps. We won't use 311 data because the government is going to know about what's going on in my community. And when that happens, there's a concept that we have been working on in New York City for my time in New York City. We did some research with NYU around this called data poverty. And that is that there are communities in New York City that don't have data that represents themselves. And when they don't have data that represents themselves, they can't get, people can't respond to them during emergencies, whether it's Sandy, whether it's 911, so on and so forth, right? And so I think that comes into play, and we have to think about making sure that these underserved communities understand that their rights are being protected. And I think that's a complex conversation, but in order for their rights to be protected, they have to know to be a part of and share their information with, such that we can be able to respond to them.
And I think, and to Amin's point, I think a lot of this has to do with data ethics, and it's a question of providing that assurance that and being, it's really everything we've been talking about all day, transparency, data minimization, and also the purpose for why it's being used. And I think we also have to look back at, some of the essential orders and stay-at-home orders in certain jurisdictions like India or Bangladesh or in Africa, or here in the US, right? In certain urban centers, the idea of shelter in place and privacy, I mean, even that notion may not really be part of people's actual reality. We're seeing a lot of things laid bare in terms of, continuing with education being online. And there's a privacy issue, but there's also a fundamental issue of if students don't have access to the internet. So what we're seeing now is, I agree with Amen, a lot of societal issues that have been present, globally, that will continue to be present, but we also have to think about an innovative way to address data ethics in a time like this.
Yeah, and I would say this. I think there's two separate issues. I think Amin's absolutely right. The same fundamental societal drivers that resulted in the tragedy that was Katrina have never gone away. They didn't go away before. I think one of the things we have to kind of be really cognizant of is, and I don't know how the other speakers feel, I have not been on a panel with three black folks on the panel and one white moderator. That hasn't happened to me in my profession. So I actually think there's a fundamental difference in opportunity here, where we have folks of black, brown, other kinds of persuasions. I think you look at Asians in America now, they are suffering. Historically, Chinese in America have suffered most closely to African Americans, and it is now resurfacing yet again. Those fundamental drivers underlay. What I worry about is the president of my company wrote a book called Tools and Weapons, and we're going to start building a whole bunch of tools. And we're not really talking, by the way, about people are very willing to give up their plasma and give up their cellular rights to kind of get a solution or a cure. And there's no back-end guarantee they're going to get that cure. For those who don't understand that, go check out the Henrietta Lack story and kind of understand the concepts underlying that. But what I would say at this point is we really, really, really have to have a conversation on all levels of this society about what we really want to do and be. And I think we just have to recognize that this data issue is now pervasive. This is not new, by the way. The data issue was actually started with credit card companies in the 50s. That's when you started having a real data problem. But what we have to do now is we have to start recognizing amongst ourselves there are valid uses of data. There are ways we need to consider compensating people for those valid uses of the data. And just because there is a valid use does not mean a person gives up rights to any other use of that data, nor should they ever cede that right. And I think those are the types of things we have to bring. If everybody in this conference fundamentally understands that from an individual level, we somehow have to generate that into policy and action so that we can actually tackle this problem, which is not going to go away when COVID-19 goes away. We are going to be back in this situation again in 3 to 5 years, if we're lucky 10, because that is just the nature of how life kind of exists or persists in this world. So I really do feel like we should all try to dig in and say, this is hard. There's a lot of people who come at this with really bad intentions. But there's also a lot of good that can come out of this, and we have to drive forward and really hold these principles up front. And I think there's an opportunity. I think that's what separates it for me. We're having kind of all of our history lessons happen in about a 5-month period, and we're living it. And it's just really an opportunity for everybody to dig in and say, what are the policies we have in place? And if we don't come to grips with this data issue, we'll never be able to keep ourselves safe, because people will find ways to evade. If this is not something that you can make people do. We've got to get people to trust the system, and we have to have people live by and abide by certain commitments they make and be held accountable to them. And that's the way we'll get out of this.
Thank you so much, Neal. I can feel your passion for these issues all the way from here. So I really love that we started going into more of the exact policy conversation, because one of the issues that I like to talk about, and we had the opportunity to talk about last week, is talking about our fundamental rights and freedoms around data protection, and whether we are considering data rights as fundamental human rights and the human right to privacy, or whether we're getting into a different type of conversation about data ownership and data ownership as a property right. And what are the fundamentals of each of these? We're talking about transparency. We're talking about consent and opt-in. We're talking about, on the ownership side, the opportunity to share our data and get a monetary or valued reward in return for sharing that. So when we're talking about the different projects around coronavirus, we can think about either that we are consenting to our data being used for the good of humanity, or are we going to expect that in the coming months, in the coming years, that we will have a digitally literate enough population that people will be able to consensually opt in, as opposed to governments and companies going ahead and just getting access to that data and informing us afterwards why they've used it. This is the type of debate I'd love for us to go into.
Well, I pontificated for too long, so I'm not going to start.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think this is really the tough question that we have to decide as a society. I agree with what Neal was saying, the opt-in, getting people to trust the system and to share the information on them, I think said the same thing. But it's going to be a challenge because there have been prior abuses or perceived abuses. And then we have to look at things, sort of holistically. And this is all about all the players, governmental actors, regulators, legislators, private companies, and also citizens on the individual level, humans on the individual level, deciding what these value propositions mean for them. I worry sometimes about data completely as a property right, although there is a component there, but I worry about it because will it turn into those that need the money the most giving up their data, and others, we already have that with the clinical trials with health tests, healthcare and so forth. Will it turn into that, or is there some other way we can look at, the bundling of data and, looking at the bundles of data as part of a property right. But these are complex issues that are going to need to be dealt with. I think right now, in the question of the pandemic, the right answer, it seems to me, is to, as fast as we need to move, is to bring to bear all of the lessons we have learned on data privacy and data protection and data security over the past 25 years, really, and really supercharge that and infuse it at the inception as we're building these products, as we're building these tools to help curb the pandemic. But I don't think the right answer is drop privacy completely, drop data security completely, and let's just move forward. So I think it has to be this, leveraging what we've already learned through a number of other missteps in the past to make sure that these new tools are infused with the good steps that we've talked about to encourage that trust, because that's, if that starts, that's how we can get people to actually feel comfortable sharing with the government this information, so that it doesn't turn into it's used against people for immigration purposes, for criminal investigations, other things. There's just a lot that was alluded to in your first keynote and your second keynote that we just would need to, I think everybody in this ecosystem could take steps to help encourage that trust, because we all have to work together.
So I'll throw in here, if you don't mind. And let me start by saying, when I was in the city, I used to always engage the lawyers around a lot of the data usage and the things we would do. And so I had to characterize them. I had to put them into buckets of the good lawyers and the lawyers that I never went to go talk to because they weren't helpful. Both Neal and Dominique, I would put into the good lawyer bucket. They would be the ones I would be going right to because they have such a big a way of looking at this beyond just the legalese, and I really appreciate that because that's that sort of thinking is what it takes. The way I'll answer that question, the question you asked, Brittany, is so I think everything that Dominique said is spot on. I fully agree. In my career, I've come at it from a different angle only because the legal space is a space I get lost in, and so because you're there. I think that we must empower people in these communities to think about data differently. When I came to New York City to take on that role, what I found was we had, put out thousands of data sets onto New York City's open data portal for use, and tons of really smart people were using that data to impact their lives. None of them were from the communities that I'm from, right? And so we instituted a strategy called Open Data for All, which was we didn't want just NYU students and Columbia University students and hedge fund data scientists on their off time using open data. We wanted to expand the use. And so I know Own Your Data is about this, and this is very important, is going to every corner of every community everywhere and espousing the usefulness of data. Because once that happens, where there are no top-down regulations, people will begin demanding their rights, demanding more data once they understand the value of that data and the value to them. And the governments will have to meet them where they are, right? The good governments that understand that, I always used to say when I used to work with agencies and say, hey, you have to release this open data. And so, well, there's challenges and so on and so forth, and it's going to take some time. I said, look, here's the way we have to think about it. It's not the government's data. The residents paid taxes. They paid for that data. That's their data. Make it available to them, right? And so once people understand that that's actually our data that's being, and Dominique mentioned data stewardship, that's being just stewarded by us, they're going to push us and they're going to drive us and they're going to engage us aggressively, and we have to respond. So there is certainly the top down in regulation and process and protocols, but there has to be a bottom-up engagement with folks in the community to open up this treasure trove of capability to them.
So I completely agree. The only counter I would put, particularly for, it's not exclusively, but particularly for minority communities or other types of at-risk communities, is that trust is directly related to how the people who are using that data and using those tools, how it's being used against that population. And if you have a history, and you pointed this out actually going back to Katrina, and we can go further, if you have a history of government not responding to your needs, I don't know if you saw the article about the doctor who's basically testing homeless in Miami, who was put in handcuffs on his lawn because a cop caught an attitude because he didn't think the black guy was being polite enough. That's the problem. You've got to rebuild that trust in all communities, but particularly in diverse communities, that government and the tools and apparatus of government are actually going to be used to help to benefit people. And that's also true of businesses, quite frankly. If businesses continue to come at this for ways to make a buck at the expense of others, they're going to lose that trust. They're going to lose that ability to kind of be able to work with that data in a fair and reasonable way. And you're not going to be able to earn it back. And I think, that's that accountability model, which is, it's an unfair fight to say, let us use the data and we'll kind of keep it safe, and then there's no consequence for the not keeping it safe or the misuse. And that's not limited to government. That is big business as well. But I think that's what we have to kind of marry up.
Yeah, I'm so excited that you decided to go there. So I'm a human rights lawyer by training, and I have worked on various cases around the world. But what I do know is that human rights law is sometimes very difficult to enforce. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it's very difficult to be successful in a prosecution. So if we're going to talk about enforcement and the stopping of abuse, this is why I like to talk about data ownership as a property right, because in most legislative frameworks around the world, property is very well protected. And if someone damages your property, you actually have legal recourse to do something about it. So I was the first, the only expert witness in the first successful case against Equifax. And we sued Equifax for property damage in the state of Minnesota and won at the Supreme Court. So data is your property in the state of Minnesota because of that case. Now, obviously, that was negligence. Equifax let over 300 security certificates expire and didn't run over 8,500 system updates when they were hacked and our data was damaged. So that's obviously an extreme case. But when we're talking about enforcement of our rights, where we can actually do something to prevent and punish abuse, I think that it's an interesting tool. And I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on that.
So let me jump in there, because I totally agree with Neal's sentiment and how you framed it, Brittany. Let me say this, and that's why I've been bringing up open data. So the power of open data, as I've seen it and experienced it over the last decade, is that it pushes data that has normally been managed in the catacombs of government agencies and says, hey, this is actually not ours, this is yours. But what's in that data is interesting, because you're opening up how the city actually engages with the resident. So there's an example of a data scientist who took parking ticket data and basically looked at one of the ordinances where in New York City, we used to make it illegal to park in pedestrian ramps, in front of pedestrian ramps. I think it was the early 90s, we made it legal because there was just not enough parking spaces. So we wanted to open up some parking spaces. So we made it legal. But someone didn't tell NYPD. So they were still ticketing people, right? To the tune of millions of dollars a year, millions of dollars a year. My office released open data around ticketing. This data scientist took that, did some Google Maps views where there were pedestrian ramps, and took the ticketing data that was on open data and basically said, wow, something afoot is happening, right? And this is not okay. Reached out to my office and said, I'm going to New York Times and Wall Street Journal with this story that NYPD essentially has been wrongly ticketing people. The whole point, and Neal's point around trust comes when you open up the data and you say, hey, and so let me end that story by saying NYPD said, you know what, you're right. Thank you for that analysis. We're going to change our processes. We're going to change our protocols, and we're going to change how we do ticketing, and we're going to train better, and so on and so forth. So from that, NYPD is functioning more efficiently. When you open up data that way, you begin to build that trust. We cannot look to, repair trust in the next 2 years that has been broken over the last few decades, right? You can't do that. But what you can do, at least in my space, there's a lot of things you can do, but in the data space, you can open up data and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Community, this is what we have been doing. This is the rate with which we've been filling potholes. This is who we've been ticketing. This is who we've been arresting. And then challenge us on that, and then engage us on the data that we're opening up. If we're not opening up enough, if we're not opening up the right data. That is what, from that perspective, does build the trust. So I'm not just talking about transparency. Transparency gets trust. And that's what's going to be important about with respects to human rights, is that transparency of what is going on. People get to challenge whether you're infringing on their human rights. And that's going to be key.
Yeah, I think the openness is key to, transparency is key both for governmental entities and for private institutions. And to just, I think, open up a dialogue about what it takes to actually get certain things accomplished and what that individual might be giving up in order for the greater good. I think transparency is just going to have to be absolutely key. And then sticking with the word of why you say you're collecting the data and how long you say that you're going to be keeping it is important. And through this, maybe sort of a data literacy will evolve, because I agree with them. And like, we do need to, and this is what Neal was saying, we do need to engage everybody in the discussion, and especially for underserved communities in the U.S. or globally, some other countries that do not have the same resources on the per capita level that we do, to just begin to think globally about how do we involve those communities in the discussion, so that they, number one, know what's being collected, how it's being shared, and how they can understand the wonderful openness that is made available to them. Because if you put open source code out, but nobody knows, does not have the digital literacy to be able to interpret it, it's a whole, everything is a data company. I wrote a book called Transform Data as a Pre-Tangible Asset in a Post-Data World, and it's all about every company, everything that we do in society right now is data driven, and it's just a question of whether people are aware of it or not. And how do we, and this goes to the school systems. I mean, Neal and I did another program before on a similar topic, but I mean, there's statistics and AI going into literally children, whether they have a propensity to find themselves homeless later when they're adults or in prison. And there's decisions that are being made and resources deployed probably along with those decisions that we can all be a part of, helping to change that view. So in a sense, I mean, to go back to Neal's original point, and with respect to data ethics, I think diversity behind the table, around the table, with different points of view to help on things like, if facial recognition is going to be part of this discussion, making sure that that works, with people of color, and that it's even effective. And so I think we have to just make sure that we have a pipeline of people involved all the way around, but that we're thinking very holistically about this global pandemic, because I think we've seen now that because something exists in another continent doesn't mean that it can't have a radical impact on all of our lives, anywhere in the globe. So really trying to look at this globally is so key.
One last piece I would encourage to kind of put pressure on now is, do not underestimate in the U.S. the impact of the Carter Page FBI investigation on how people are thinking about these issues, where after 9/11, there was this great move to kind of make sure we had this surveillance state to protect against any damages. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting debate that's going on in the federal government among people who don't usually have this debate. And I'm talking about the right side of the aisle. And I actually think there's an opportunity to link up the far right libertarians with some of the far left, rights folks, mm-hmm. to put a pinch on the idea that you can't manage how law enforcement uses data, but more importantly, is held accountable for its use of data. And I just think this is a moment in time where we don't, if we could formulate our ideas in a real thoughtful way, I do believe there are people who are receptive to having a more open conversation about what the right line should be. And that's going to be a necessary part of this if people are going to feel comfortable contributing data into something that really tracks their health and distributes that information outward. So in any event,
I'm really excited you mentioned that, because the reason why me and my co-founder Brent had so much legislative success over the past few years in our data lobbying group was specifically because we started working in the state of Wyoming, which is nearly completely libertarian. And most of the legislators there, whether they are Democrats or they are Republicans, technically, they do have very libertarian values about enshrining individual rights. So in the state of Wyoming, your digital assets are your intangible personal property. Right. So you do have property rights over assets, your property that you cannot touch. And ascribing those rights has blossomed an entire new tech boom in the state of Wyoming, where they're replacing coal with coding, so to say. And there's incredible collaboration across the aisle, specifically around these issues in technology policy. And I found it incredibly exciting, rewarding, and has brought, as far as I know right now, billions of dollars into the state, specifically because of that. So I'm very glad that you talked about that cross-aisle collaboration on these issues, because I've had direct experience of it. And I really think, and I hope, that we can achieve something similar over the coming years at the national level. There's a lot of incredible people in Congress that have been working for so long on these issues, but obviously we're still going state by state right now, little by little. We've got some great wins in California and also in the state of New York. The New York Privacy Act, I've gotten involved in the last few drafts of that. We're at draft number 3, which should have its 3rd public hearing as soon as we're allowed to gather again. And that will be a landmark piece of legislation that goes even further than CCPA and would be what all of the firms that you, Dominique, represent, as well as Neal, would be looking to abide by. And data ownership as a property right is something that we've been debating a lot. That's led by Senator Kevin Thomas, who's absolutely amazing and unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. But I do suggest reading his latest draft, which is available publicly, and I can circulate that to speakers afterwards. So I know we've got about 14 minutes left. I'm going to check some of the questions that are being upvoted over here, because I know a lot of members of the audience are pretty excited. Okay, so the top one right now is, what are your opinions on the Google-Apple collaboration on the tracking app based on Bluetooth? Necessary evil or just evil is the way that they have phrased it. Obviously, you can take that in whatever way you'd like and run with it.
Let me start and say I don't know a lot of the details. I only know what I was able to read. What I appreciated was at least their attempt, from what I read, to try to abide by some kind of privacy protections of what they're building out. I don't know I don't know if it's enough to only come from corporations. So again, I would argue corporations can start, but you need other voices to make sure all the perspectives are being brought in. But I know for both of those companies, I think it's a bold statement for them to come together and do something in a way where they state very publicly they're at least trying to uphold privacy rights and principles. So again, I don't know if it's fully executed in the right way. I don't know all the issues. There's a lot of issues on both sides, but from what I saw in the news report that I read, I did appreciate that was front and center for them in their announcement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was my reaction to that. At least privacy was, top of mind, and there is, from what I've read, it appears that there is an attempt to keep the data anonymized and not identifiable to a person. That might diminish some of the, full-on effectiveness in terms of analytics, but at least it gets the information to the user of the app or the software if it's embedded in the iOS or the Google platform. It will get the information to them if they have been exposed to someone who is tested positive. Because I think, that the reality is we're going to have to leverage technology to be able to put this pandemic into some kind of advance. And we're just going to have to do that if we want to do anything to scale. And I think the long history, with companies like Microsoft and others that generated in terms of consumer trust is really important in that effort. And so, yes, there have been, every company scaling and addressing privacy as it evolves and data security as it evolves. But we're just going to have to use technology, but we want privacy and data security to be built into the thinking. So anonymized data. I liked what I saw with the United Nations chart that your first speaker had in terms of thinking about, data minimization, anonymization, and what's the game plan for deleting that data once the immediate crisis is addressed.
Mm-hmm.
I think my immediate reaction to it, and the consistent thread for me is, Dominique, you mentioned sort of facial recognition and us being, being able to be detected in facial recognition based on a lot of research that was done that said, well, if white developers develop this facial recognition code, it's less likely to be efficient for non-white faces in terms of recognition. So my question would be, Joy Buolamwini at MIT did a lot of that research to identify sort of this AI bias. My question would be, sure, data privacy is in security is being taken into consideration, but are they building this to ensure that it has the same impact for highly trafficked, communities in Midtown Manhattan and Lower Manhattan and Soho and so on and so forth, but then also communities in the South of Bronx, in Brooklyn, in LA, so on and so forth, right? And so what are the disparities in terms of the effectiveness? Because what we know is communities that aren't represented, that's data poverty, right? Communities that aren't represented in this work don't get the resources, don't get impacted, don't get the things that they're supposed to get in order to be helped. And so my question would be, are they taking into consideration all communities will be able to be seen and engaged through this mechanism?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that topic, I just wanted to bring up that some of the data science work that I used to do in countries that have massive disparities in economic status, a lot of companies and even government departments considered the data of those people to be worth more because there was less of it. You talk about data poverty. So it's harder to access that data. Therefore, if those individuals had ownership over their data and could put that onto a data exchange, their data would be worth more money than the people who are creating tons of data all of the time that is readily available and purchasable or licensable, right? So some of the work specifically I was doing in Mexico was addressing a lot of that. And a lot of the conversations I have with policymakers in countries like India, for example, they see the idea of data ownership as one of the easiest and most practical solutions to lifting billions of people out of poverty. Right? When you start to look at that. So I wanted to just kind of make a concluding remark on the way that I see this and then allow each of you to wrap up, which is that obviously we'll talk about in the next session, digital literacy and how to inform the public to understand their data and understand what to share, what not to share, how to keep things private if they so choose. And that's going to develop over the coming years. Obviously, we will become a more digitally literate world. We've only just kind of really embarked on leading a fully digital life, right? But right now, most people don't understand how to control their data. So I'd like to land the plane for everyone by giving one of my favorite business models, which is Airbnb. So if you owned your data like your property, just like you do your house, and someone wanted to have access to it, just like on Airbnb, they could tell you who they are, what they want to use your property for, how long they're going to use it, and what they're going to be doing with it, and you agree on a price before you hand away the keys. And so that's what I really see the future of transparency and consent and even monetization of data and ownership to look like. And a lot of countries are now experimenting with different COVID apps where people are logging in consensually and deciding to share data or self-report. It's harder to get everyone to download it if it's not enforced on people, but the consent model is something that we should be exploring. So I'll kick it over to you guys for concluding remarks because we just have a few minutes left.
Amin, you want to go first, or you want me to?
I'll go. No worries. Appreciate that. One, thank you, Brittany, for bringing us together for this conversation. This was great. A lot of people watching, but also this would have been great with just the four of us sitting down, and because there's so much content that came out of this that I think is actionable. And I think that that's the thing that's most powerful, is that we take a lot of these things that we discuss and really drive action through them, because the consequences are just so dire if we do not move aggressively in this space. And I think, unfortunately, this is one of those spaces where very few people, understand in an expert way, right? And, Neal mentioned that, my other two panelists happen to be African-American. That's a new, for me, in terms of in this conversation, right? And so we need to get everyone on board, Latinos, Asian, everyone on board, every group of people that have felt left out, felt marginalized, and felt like their rights have been trampled on because of their data that was used against us. There has to be a mechanism to engage and drive this, because I just can't imagine a world where we don't get on top of this. I know that there's policy. I always used to joke around from my time in New York City that the legislation, city council there, their love language is laws, right? And so they pass tons of laws all the time, but we had to get into these communities and drive these efforts, laws and no laws. So I'm looking forward to, engaging with everyone here, everyone listening, to try to move these things forward.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate you being here with us today. And I'll kick it over to Neal for concluding statements, and hopefully we'll be able to get Dominique on there as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, first of all, thank you. I think Amin framed the comment I meant to make the right way, which is, this is the first time I've been able to be on a panel with Black panelists to talk about this type of issue rather than some vague question of diversity. So appreciate that opportunity. I would also say that I think that the most important thing we have to do is we really have to decide, where do we want to take all of this forward, and are we committed to taking it forward? And I know I know I get a lot of comments from a lot of people about, being African-American and working in a place like Microsoft, and a lot of people will come from the perspective of it's very much part of the system. And what I would say to you is, you have no idea how revolutionary the three people on this panel are, given the lives they've had to live in the business world. You have absolutely no idea how radical we are. So one of the big challenges I always have to manage on these conferences is what I really think about, and then what my job requires me to do. But know that there's a bunch of us in corporations that are really pushing and testing and stretching the boundaries of how these companies think about these issues, not just as they relate to minorities, but as they relate to everybody. And if you're an African American in this country, you do not come from money. You might have money now, but you come from a place where you understand what a frontline worker is. And so there are those of us inside the system who are trying to stretch the system to make sure the system works for everybody and not just for a select few. And that's a privilege I have. I'm in the system, that I understand that privilege I have. But it's just, we have to push these companies, but the companies are also going to need to push, the government's going to need to push from individuals. And I think organizations like this, I think conferences like this really give us an opportunity to kind of hone and sharpen the arguments, to really define the culture we need to define. And I think COVID has exposed a lot of challenges that we have in societies around the world, and that creates an enormous amount of opportunity. So in any event, just thank you so much for the opportunity. I think Dominique is probably having a challenge with her connection, so I'm hoping I've carried this long enough. So Dominique, come on. There we go. Almost, not quite.
Almost. Thank you guys so much for your passion. Thank you for sharing all of your work with us and being here with us today at our inaugural summit. It means so much to me. And I know we can't get Dominique on right now for concluding statements, but if there's anything additional that you want to add, we will have the opportunity to submit written comment. Oh, we have just under a minute left before this kicks us into the next session. Dominique, if you would like to say goodbye to everyone for the day. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Brittany, for having us. I really enjoyed the conversation with you, Neal, and then I agree with everything that is said. And, you know, data protection, data privacy go hand in hand with this pandemic. A lot of us are working around the clock to make sure that those rights are being protected at the same time that we're leveraging technology.
Thank you so much. And we're just about to be kicked off to Ilu, our incredible music artist, to give us a 5-minute interlude for you guys to make another coffee before the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.